The preceding video introduced the idea of large N trials, the term we use for trials done with a lot, maybe hundreds or maybe even thousands of farmers, in order to understand complex interactions and contribute to generating context-specific recommendations. In this video, we will look at a few of the ways of doing this and what might need rethinking compared to the way we often do trials now. If we look at a typical crop experiment done with farmers, there are a number of steps. It starts with some initial planning of objectives and engagement with farmers and their communities. Which of these comes first depends on whether the research topic and approach is driven by farmers or researchers. Thereafter, there are a number of common steps to go through. And at the end, there should be a loop back to planning the next round of activity, perhaps a follow-up trial. Looking at this flow, there are two obvious bottlenecks, which often limit the size of trials that are practical. If researchers, technicians and facilitators lay out and plant the trials, and collect the performance data at harvest time, then they have to visit each farm when it's time to plant, and again when it's time to harvest. They might collect other data, such as household or soil data at other times, but having to visit each farm at both planting and harvest severely limits the number of farms that can be involved. So, the solution here is simple. Arrange the trial so that farmers take responsibility for activities that lead to these bottlenecks. This could well have the added advantage of giving farmers a greater stake in the trial, with the various benefits that can lead to. Let's take a closer look at each of these activities and some of the major issues to consider when planning for farmers to do these activities. If farmers are to lay out and plant their own trials, they will need to receive training and the resources needed for the trial. The training could be done by extension workers, and some projects have actually used other farmers to do the training, perhaps farmers that have already been involved in previous trials. Consider the implications on the design of your study when taking this approach. Farmers, even well-trained farmers, will benefit from a simple design. Keep the layout and management requirements simple. For example, have fewer treatments than you might have if professional researchers were involved in setting up at every farm. Keep the areas used as small as feasible. Also, try to account for the farmers' current management practices in the design, so they do not have to manage the trial plots any differently from their regular plots. It is at this point that farmers need to start keeping records, and they will need guidance on how to do that effectively. If they are laying out and planting the trial, then they need a way of recording what was planted, where and when, for example. Similarly, for farmers to successfully measure trials and record data, you need to design simple procedures. For example, it might be acceptable to assess yield on a 5-point scale from 1, meaning poor or much worse than I am used to 5, which means excellent or far higher than I am used to. And you could do this rather than trying to estimate an exact quantity. Some variables, such as disease level, might be recorded by reference to a pictorial key or reference scale. But one thing is clear. You can only expect farmers to return useful data on variables that they are actually interested in. When researchers collect their own data, they continually make judgments on how to deal with unexpected situations. Farmers need to make such judgments in ways that will generate useful data, so guidelines need to anticipate them and make unambiguous recommendations. For example, when is a value considered missing? When should it be recorded as 0? And how can the fact it was eaten by goats be recorded? It is important to carefully consider and plan the procedures for recording and capturing your data. The simpler the process, the easier it will be to train the farmers to collect the required data, and the more likely you are to receive accurate and reliable measurements. Pencil and a well-designed form can be a very effective way for farmers to record data, but other possibilities are emerging and deserve consideration. Using digital devices such as mobile phones may help, especially now that more and more people are used to using mobile devices. Smartphones and tools such as the Open Data Kit can let farmers collect and transmit data, including photos and GPS coordinates, with relative ease. Farmers with feature phones can send data via SMS text messaging. Another possibility using digital devices is allowing two-way communication with farmers. A potentially powerful way of getting farmers to buy into the project is to offer to give back relevant information, such as contextualized results from the study. This sort of feedback is currently being considered by many groups, and as of autumn 2015, apps are being developed to link with the Open Data Kit to allow farmers to contribute to large projects and receive customized feedback through the same project. Regardless of how you decide to plan your study, make sure to thoroughly test your recording and data capture procedures. You should aim to pilot them with farmers to make sure that the procedures are suitable for both the data you wish to collect and the farmers who will be collecting the data. For example, farmers who find it hard to read or write may prefer more visual methods of recording data. Digital and paper-based forms can be created to include graphical prompts instead of lengthy question text. Since having farmers collect data in trials is still not common practice, you will probably have to develop methods of your own and not rely on others' experience that is already published. Expect to develop, test, and refine methods as you need them, and pilot anything you try very carefully. Finally, there may be some measurements you need for your research that are just not suitable for farmers to record. Maybe they are deemed too complex, and there isn't enough time to properly train the farmers involved. Maybe the measurements require a level of impartiality that the farmers themselves may not have. In a large N design, it is feasible to plan to collect these measurements on a subset of the farms involved, and then you have your researchers and technical staff collect them. We often hear that farmers have messed up a trial in some way, by which researchers mean that it has not gone as they had hoped. This is often due to poor communications between researchers and the others involved, farmers and extension workers. There is a separate video that explores the issue of communication between researchers, farmers, and extension workers. But here is a summary of what farmers need to understand in order to properly take ownership of a trial, which is something that is necessary if the large N approach is to be successful. This understanding is at 3 levels: the overall aim, how the design works, and the details of the activity. The overall aim includes the problem being studied, the options to be tested, what is not known, and the purpose of the experiment. The details include a lot of the practicalities of conducting the trial, the space that's needed on each farm, who does what and when, who provides the resources, and who owns the outputs, as well as other issues. How the design works, well, let's discuss that in a moment. In large N trials, with farmers taking increased responsibility for the key processes in the trial, this investment in developing a common understanding is very important. So what about the design? It is important for farmers to understand not only what they are meant to do, but also some of the concepts behind the design and how the design actually works. Some of this might be obvious, but it is worth making it explicit, as other interpretations are possible. Researchers don't often spend much time on this when training farmers to take part in trials, but understanding these ideas will help farmers gain a sense of ownership and encourage more investment in the activity. We have identified 11 points that are important for farmers to understand, which are shown here on this slide. How best to help farmers gain this understanding is beyond the scope of this video, but you need to include these design ideas within the training that you plan for your farmers. At the beginning of the previous video, I listed these principles of experimental design. They are all still relevant when designing large N trials to be done with farmers, but some of the consequences and common ways they are implemented might be different. For example, the treatment design is likely to be simple. Not every farmer needs to test every treatment, and farmer choice of what to test could be part of the process. The plot size and shape might vary between farmers, within some limits, to accommodate varying resources and interests of farmers. Replication is likely to be all between farm, there being little value added in having replicates within a single farm. Give careful thought to aspects of the experiment that really need to be standardized across all plots, and those which can and should be adapted to each farmer or location. Then there are a few more principles, which I think need adding to the list when we use large N designs. Included here are the choice of contexts. Be deliberate in your choice of social and biophysical contexts in which the experiment is done. And this idea is covered in another video. The next principle is understanding the importance of bias and keeping it to a minimum. Classical experiments are designed to give precise results. With large N trials, we can get estimates of mean effects as precise as we want by increasing the sample size. But bias, meaning the systematic under- or overestimating of effects, does not go away if we increase the numbers of farmers included. And related to the previous point is that variation, particularly variation of results across farms, becomes as important as averages. But that is another story. Finally, I must emphasize that we are not suggesting that large N trials are the future of all agricultural research and development. The tools we have become used to, such as trials done in one or a few research stations, or on-farm trials with a modest numbers of farmers, are still important. But the large N ideas extend the range of possibilities. As with any new method or approach, we will learn good practice by being imaginative, by trying things out, by reflecting on what we have done, by learning, and by discussing what we have learned.